One man's loneliness reshaped the face of horror, not through what he did, but through what he revealed about us. There's a farmhouse in Wisconsin, empty now, forgotten by most, but its shadow stretches across every horror film you've ever seen. Norman Bates exists because of it. Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, Hannibal Lecter. The entire language of modern psychological horror traces back to one isolated man. Ed Gein never made a film, never wrote a book, never sought fame. He lived alone, died in obscurity, barely spoke to anyone for decades. But his psychology, his fractured, isolated, utterly detached mind became a mirror reflecting something we don't want to see, our own capacity for emptiness, for disconnection, for losing the boundaries that make us human. Directors saw it, writers saw it, the world saw it and couldn't look away, not because he was a monster, but because he was human, and that terrifies us more than any supernatural evil ever could. So why are we fascinated by darkness? Why does his story, told carefully, philosophically, without sensationalism, still matter? Because it reveals a truth about the human condition. Isolation doesn't just make you lonely, it unmakes you. And understanding that might be the only thing that keeps us human. Before we go further, let's be clear about what this is. This isn't a true crime documentary. It's not a biography of violence. This is a psychological exploration, a philosophical investigation into how one man's fractured mind became the blueprint for cinematic horror. 1960, Alfred Hitchcock releases Psycho. Norman Bates, the quiet motel owner, dominated by his mother, fragmented personality, unable to distinguish between love and control. The film shocked audiences, not because of gore, there's barely any, but because of psychology, because Norman seemed so ordinary, so sympathetic, so human, until he wasn't. Hitchcock based Norman Bates on Ed Gein, not directly, not explicitly, but the psychology, the mother obsession, the isolation creating fracture. That came from understanding what happened in rural Wisconsin, 1974. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Leatherface, the masked killer in a house of horror. But look deeper. He's not a villain. He's a victim of his family, isolated, controlled, used. He doesn't speak, doesn't individuate. He's a tool, an extension of a toxic system. The filmmakers studied Ed Gein's psychology, the isolation, the maternal control, the complete absence of normal social development, and they asked what would that look like in a family system. 1991. The Silence of the Lambs. Buffalo Bill. Not the cannibalistic psychiatrist, that's a different archetype, but Buffalo Bill, the killer obsessed with transformation, with becoming someone else, because his own identity was never allowed to form. The writer Thomas Harris researched Ed Gein extensively, not the acts, the psychology, the desperate need for connection expressed through the only means a fractured mind understands. These aren't coincidences. These are artists recognizing something profound, that the scariest monsters aren't supernatural, they're psychological. They're what happens when human development goes catastrophically wrong. When isolation, control, and deprivation of connection create a mind that can no longer navigate reality. Ed Gein didn't create these characters. His psychology did. Or more accurately, our collective horror at recognizing that psychology could happen to anyone under the right circumstances. That's what we're exploring here. Not what happened, but why it matters. Why this one man's fractured existence became the foundation for how we tell stories about darkness. Because those stories aren't really about him. They're about us, about what we fear, about what we recognize, about the thin line between sanity and dissolution, and about what happens when human connection, the thing that keeps us grounded, disappears completely. 1906, Plainfield, Wisconsin. A farming community, small, isolated. the kind of place where neighbors are miles apart and winters are brutal. Ed Gein was born into isolation, not chosen, inherited. His family lived on the edge, a farmhouse distant from town, no close neighbors, no regular visitors. This wasn't unusual for rural America then, but the Geins took it further. His father, George, an alcoholic, largely absent, weak, a man who existed more as void than presence. His mother, Augusta, dominant, religiously extreme, controlling. She ran everything, the farm, the household, her children's minds. And her worldview was absolute. The world is corrupt. People are sinful. Trust no one. Need no one. Ed had one brother, Henry, older, less compliant, eventually questioning. But Ed absorbed everything, because he had nothing else. No friends, minimal schooling, no alternative perspective, no mirror except his mother's face. When you grow up in complete isolation, the person who controls your environment controls your reality. This is the psychology of deprivation. Humans are social creatures, not by preference, by biology. Our brains develop through interaction. We learn language by hearing others speak. We learn boundaries by testing them with peers. We learn empathy by experiencing diverse perspectives. We discover who we are by seeing ourselves reflected in multiple relationships. Ed had one relationship, his mother. And she didn't reflect him. She molded him, shaped him, suppressed him. Every natural developmental impulse, curiosity, independence, sexuality, identity formation, was met with religious condemnation. The world outside, evil. Women outside the family, whores, independence, betrayal of God and family. This creates what psychologists call enmeshment. When your identity doesn't develop separately from your caregiver, you can't distinguish your thoughts from theirs, your desires from their commands, yourself from their construction. You become an extension, not a person. Psychologically, this is devastating, because humans need individuation, the process of becoming separate, autonomous, capable of independent thought. Without it, you remain psychologically infantile, dependent, unable to navigate the world alone. But here's the tragedy. Ed wasn't aware this was happening. He thought his mother's worldview was reality, not one perspective, the only perspective. He thought her control was love, her restrictions were protection, her isolation was safety, because he had no comparison, no other experience, no alternative model of human connection. And his father, absent, passive, offering no counterbalance, no different example of masculinity or relationship, just absence. So Ed grew up physically, 30 years, 40 years, but psychologically, he remained a child, dependent, unable to form connections outside the family system. His brother Henry started questioning, started working away from the farm, started seeing how abnormal their situation was. And then Henry died, 1944, circumstances unclear. Now it was just Ed and Augusta, the enmeshment total, complete. Until 1945, Augusta died. Ed was 39 years old. He'd spent 39 years with one human connection, one voice defining reality, one source of identity. And then, silence. Imagine living your entire existence in a small room with one other person. They tell you everything about the world outside. They define every word, every concept, every value. Your entire sense of what's real, what's acceptable, what matters, filtered through them. Then suddenly they're gone. The room is still small, but now it's empty. You're alone with thoughts that aren't fully yours, rules you never questioned, a worldview that only made sense when someone else was enforcing it. This is where Ed Gein's mind began to fracture, not through violence, through emptiness. The most dangerous human state isn't rage, it's detachment. When connection is completely severed, the mind doesn't just grieve, it loses its anchor to reality. Social norms are learned through social interaction. Boundaries are reinforced through human feedback. Empathy develops through diverse relationships. Without any of that, those structures dissolve, not immediately, gradually. Ed stopped leaving the house except for necessities. He sealed off most rooms, lived in a shrinking space surrounded by decay. Neighbors noticed him becoming stranger, more withdrawn. Odd, but this was rural 1940s America. Eccentricity was tolerated. Loneliness wasn't intervened upon. Mental health resources, non-existent. Community support, minimal. He was just the quiet man who lived alone on the edge of town. And in that isolation, something fundamental broke. Not his morality, because morality requires a social framework to exist. His connection to reality itself. The boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate, between living and dead, between self and other. These distinctions aren't innate, they're socially constructed, constantly reinforced through human interaction. Remove the interaction and they fade. Ed Gein didn't become evil. He became empty. A mind so isolated, so deprived of human connection, that it lost the framework for being human. To understand what happened to Ed Gein's psychology, we need to go deeper. Into Jung, into Freud, into the architecture of the unconscious mind. Carl Jung talked about archetypes, universal patterns in the human psyche that appear across cultures and time. The mother is one of the most powerful, not your actual mother, the archetype, the symbolic force, the primordial image of nourishment, protection, creation, but also control, devouring possession. The mother archetype has two faces, nurturing and consuming. Healthy development means experiencing both and integrating them, understanding that care can coexist with boundaries, that love doesn't require fusion. But Augusta Gein embodied only one face, the devouring mother. She didn't nurture Ed toward independence. She consumed his identity, made him an extension of herself. Her love was conditional on total obedience, total surrender, total abandonment of self. This is the dark side of the mother archetype Jung warned about. When a child can't separate from the mother psychologically, they remain trapped, psychologically infantile, unable to form independent identity. Jung called this the mother complex, not just dependency, fusion, the inability to distinguish where mother ends and self begins. Ed never escaped this fusion, even after Augusta died, especially after she died, because now the archetype had no physical form. It existed only in his mind, as voice, as judge, as the only relationship he'd ever known. Sigmund Freud would approach this differently. Through repression, Freud built psychoanalysis on one insight. What you suppress doesn't disappear. It transforms. Augusta didn't just discourage certain behaviors. She demonized basic human needs. Sexuality, evil, curiosity about women, sin, independence, betrayal, desire, corruption. Every normal developmental impulse was met with shame, guilt, religious condemnation. So those impulses didn't develop healthily. They didn't integrate into Ed's personality. They were repressed, buried, pushed into the unconscious. But repressed material doesn't vanish. It festers, grows, distorts. Freud talked about the Oedipal complex, the developmental stage where a child differentiates from the mother and forms independent identity. Healthy resolution means accepting that you're separate, that your mother is a person, not an extension of you, that you can love without fusion. Ed never resolved this. He remained psychologically fused with Augusta, and all the normal desires, for connection, for sexuality, for independence, for identity, were repressed so deeply that they couldn't surface normally. They emerged as fragments, distortions, behaviors that made no sense because they weren't integrated into a coherent self. This is what total repression creates, not absence of desire, mutation of desire, into forms that don't recognize normal boundaries, because the boundaries were never allowed to form. Now add Jung's concept of the shadow. The shadow is everything you refuse to acknowledge about yourself, the parts of your personality that contradict your self-image. For most people, the shadow contains minor things, petty jealousies, small cruelties, selfish impulses we don't act on but know exist. Integration means acknowledging these parts, accepting them without letting them control you. But when repression is total, when an entire personality is suppressed for decades, the shadow becomes vast. Everything Ed Gein was never allowed to be lived in his shadow. Curiosity, sexuality, independence, normalcy, identity, connection. And with no healthy outlet, no social relationships, no therapeutic intervention, the shadow didn't integrate. It erupted. Not consciously. Ed didn't plan anything. He didn't have a coherent ideology or motivation. He acted from fragmentation, from a mind that had lost the ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, desire and action, acceptable and unthinkable. Jung also discussed the anima, the unconscious feminine aspect of a man's psyche. Healthy development means integrating the anima, understanding and accepting feminine qualities within yourself, relating to women as complete people. But Ed's only model of femininity was Augusta, controlling, punishing, devouring. His anima wasn't integrated, it was poisoned. He couldn't relate to women as autonomous individuals, because he'd never been allowed to. His only relationship with the feminine was through his mother, through control, fear, dependence, fusion. And when she died, he didn't grieve normally. He tried to recreate her, to maintain the only relationship he'd ever known. This is where psychology becomes tragedy, because what happened wasn't evil in the moral sense. It wasn't chosen. It was a completely fractured mind trying desperately to avoid the terror of total isolation, using the only framework it had, which was no framework at all. Freud and Jung both understood this. The human mind will do anything to avoid complete disconnection, even if the solution violates every social norm, even if it's grotesque. Because for a mind that fragmented, social norms don't exist anymore. There's only the desperate, unconscious need to not be alone. This doesn't excuse anything, but it explains something crucial. That monstrosity isn't born, it's created. Through isolation, through repression, through the destruction of normal human development. And that's far more terrifying than any supernatural evil, because it means we're all vulnerable. Under the right conditions, wrong conditions, any mind can fragment, any identity can dissolve, any person can lose the boundaries that make them human, not because they're inherently evil, because those boundaries require constant social reinforcement. Remove the reinforcement and they disappear. 1957. The world learned Ed Gein's story. The media exploded. Sensational headlines, shock, horror. But some people saw something else. Artists, writers, filmmakers who understood that the real horror wasn't the acts. It was the psychology, the how, the why, the disturbing reality that this was human, ordinary, not a supernatural monster, just someone whose mind had fractured so completely that the boundaries everyone else navigates automatically, he'd lost them entirely. This was terrifying in a new way, because it suggested that monstrosity isn't inherent. It's created through isolation, through control, through deprivation of human connection. And if it can be created, none of us are immune. Alfred Hitchcock was already developing Psycho when he learned about Ed Gein. The screenplay was based on a novel by Robert Bloch, who had been inspired by the Wisconsin case. But Hitchcock saw something deeper, an opportunity to explore psychological horror in a way cinema never had. Norman Bates wasn't a villain. He was a victim, dominated by his mother, unable to separate, fragmented into multiple personalities to cope with irreconcilable impulses. And audiences recognized him, not as a monster, as human, That was the genius and the horror. Norman seemed sympathetic, quiet, awkward, lonely, until the fracture revealed itself. Hitchcock understood what Ed Gein's story exposed, that evil doesn't announce itself. It appears as ordinary, as isolated, as human, and that's far more frightening than any obvious monster. Psycho changed cinema, not through gore, there's almost none, through psychology, through making audiences empathize with someone whose mind had broken, through forcing viewers to recognize this could be anyone, under the wrong circumstances. Tobe Hooper saw it differently. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't about one isolated man. It was about a system, a family that had isolated itself, created its own reality, lost all connection to normal social boundaries. Leatherface doesn't speak, doesn't individuate. He's a tool, an extension of a toxic family system. Sound familiar? Hooper understood that Ed Gein wasn't just an individual tragedy. He was a symbol of what happens when entire systems isolate, when families create closed realities, when no outside perspective can penetrate. The horror isn't the violence, it's the complete absence of empathy, of connection, of humanity. That's what isolation creates. Not individuals, systems that operate by their own logic, completely disconnected from the world. Jonathan Demme and Thomas Harris took it further. The Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill. Not Hannibal Lecter, he's a different archetype, the intellectual predator. That's not Ed Gein. But Buffalo Bill, the killer obsessed with transformation, with becoming someone else, because his own identity was never allowed to form. Harris researched Ed Gein's psychology extensively. The maternal control, the suppressed identity, the desperate need for transformation. Buffalo Bill isn't trying to harm people in his fractured understanding. He's trying to become whole, to construct an identity that was never permitted to develop naturally. It's tragic, horrifying, and deeply psychological. These filmmakers weren't exploiting Ed Gein's story. They were translating it from true crime into myth, into archetype, into stories that explore something fundamental about human psychology. Why were audiences fascinated? Why do these films endure? Because they let us confront our own darkness safely. Through fiction, we can explore what happens when human development fails completely, when isolation destroys empathy, when repression creates fracture, when the boundaries that keep us human dissolve. We're not celebrating violence. We're studying the absence of connection. And that absence, that's what truly terrifies us, because we recognize it, not in ourselves necessarily, but in the potential, in the fragility of sanity, in how dependent our humanity is on consistent social connection. These films work because they're not really about serial killers. They're about what we fear becoming. What we fear exists in the shadows of total isolation. Norman Bates is what happens when maternal control never releases. Leatherface is what happens when a family system completely disconnects from reality. Buffalo Bill is what happens when identity formation is so suppressed that transformation becomes desperate and distorted. These aren't villains. They're warnings about the importance of connection, of community, of intervention when isolation becomes pathological. Ed Gein's psychology became the language of modern horror because it revealed something true, that the scariest monsters are the most human ones, the ones that show us what we could become if everything that keeps us grounded, connection, empathy, social boundaries, disappeared. That's not entertainment. That's existential terror. And that's why these stories endure, why they matter. Not because they glorify darkness, because they illuminate it. They show us where the boundaries are, by showing us what happens when they're gone.